Dr. Nigel Croft has been actively involved in quality management since 1974, when he began his career in the British steel industry as a student apprentice. He's now recognized as one of the world's foremost experts in quality management and conformity assessment of management systems. He's been involved in ISO TC 176 since 1995, currently serving as chair of ISO TC 176 Subcommittee 2, the subcommittee responsible for the ISO 9001 and ISO 9004 standards, and as a member of ISO's Joint Technical Coordination Group for the Management System Standards. Nigel, take it away.
Thank you very much, Laura. It's a pleasure to be here. Normally in the old days, I would say good morning, everybody, but now, obviously with the new technologies, I have to say good morning, good afternoon. So what I thought we would talk about today is what I'm calling the new generation of management system standards. Much more forward-looking, much more user-friendly, much more all-embracing, but if we're all very honest, much more difficult to audit. So what I thought it would be appropriate for us to discuss in this Exemplar forum would be, what are the challenges that these new management system standards bring in auditing, particularly some of the more subjective requirements. I'm going to concentrate on my area of expertise, which is obviously background in quality management. So I'll be talking primarily about ISO 9001, but equally the comments that I'm making, I think, are applicable to 14001, to health and safety, to asset management, to energy management, and so on. If we look at the evolution of management system standards as we know them, I think that what we've just published in the 2015 revision of 9001 and 14001, it really is an evolutionary process, and it's not revolutionary. But if we look back, we can see gradual trends. I start to show my age now because I can remember the 1987 publication of 9001. In fact, some of its predecessors, the military standards, the British Standard 5750, and essentially they were standards that were developed for manufacturing industry, very much with the sort of original military focus, but typically they were very prescriptive, clause by clause. You know, originally we had the 20-clause structure of the 1987-1994 versions of ISO 9001, and that's not really the way that organizations work. In the year 2000, which was the last major revision to ISO 9001 prior to the 2015, we introduced this idea of the process approach. Transforming inputs, which may be raw materials, may be components, it may be information, through a series of interrelated activities to generate outputs. Hopefully those outputs will be adding value, and it will be something, whether it's a product, tangible product, or a service, that somebody will want, and ultimately that somebody is the customer. So the focus started to be on, instead of very prescriptive documentation, you know, write what you do and then do what you write is a mantra that, quite honestly, these days I hate. But it served its purpose in the old days of ISO 9001. In 2000, we introduced this idea, manage the processes and look at the results. So less focus on documentation. And that, as I'll explain a little bit further, started to introduce some difficulties for auditors. And I don't mean to be disrespectful of some of those auditors back in the early days, but back in 1987, 1988, many of the auditors were, I would call them, reformed inspectors. So we had inspectors in the oil and gas industry, in the energy industry, in the nuclear industry, and so on, who did a lead assessor course, and suddenly they became auditors of quality management systems. And that was reasonably fine while ever we had these prescriptive requirements, document-based, So they could go in and say, please show me your procedure for this, this, and this, and show me the records that demonstrate that you've done this, this, and this. Everything closes out, everything is fine, and let's get on with the audit. 9001-2000 introduced this idea, well, maybe we need to understand a little bit more about how the process works. What is important? What isn't important? How do we actually understand whether the processes are effective or not? And in the 9001-2015 revision, we've actually taken that one step further. If I'm asked to describe 9001-2015 in just a few words, I would say it's very much performance-based. So is the system delivering on its promise? Whether it's a quality management system for which the promise is confidence in the products and services that that organization is providing, or whether it's an environmental management system whose promise is to ensure that the organization is aware of the applicable legislation, is meeting that legislation, is continually improving the environmental performance, and so on. Is the system capable of doing that? And the three main core elements that we'll talk about later on in the presentation is that three-pronged approach between understanding the process, understanding what processes are needed within an organization for it to be able to achieve its objectives, whether they are, in inverted commas, quality objectives related to the product and service that's being provided, whether they are environmental objectives related to the impact that that process has on the environment, or health and safety related, or whatever. We then need to prioritize what is the degree of planning and control that we need to undertake to give us the confidence that those processes will achieve their objectives. And then we start thinking, well, where might it be necessary to have documented procedures or work instructions? And where might we be able to manage the process without those documented procedures? And then coupled with that, of course, at all levels throughout the whole organization, Plan, Do, Check, Act, which allows us then to identify eventual deficiencies in the system. Internal auditing obviously has a very, very important role to play in that. We can then look at the causes and take improvement actions. So the ACT part of the PDCA cycle doesn't just mean correcting what went wrong and looking at the causes and taking corrective action. We are now looking a little bit more proactively and saying, where does things like innovation fit in? Maybe we're looking for breakthrough improvement. Maybe we're doing things like what we used to call re-engineering of the process. And that is totally consistent with the model that we have. So about 8 or 9 years ago, a lot of discussions between ISO, my technical committee, TC176SC2, the International Accreditation Forum, IAF, IPC, the International Personnel Certification, were involved. And we looked at all the key topics that we felt were important for the credibility of ISO 9001 certification. And as very often happens, you put in an awful lot of work and you can condense the output of that work into a very simple phrase. And that very simple phrase that we came up with was output matters. So we have all of these good things that are in the quality management system that are necessary for the quality management system that we all know about. Of course you need effective leadership. Of course you need competent people. Of course you need calibrated equipment, good customer communication, all of those good things. But the acid test for the effectiveness of the system does all of that, provide confidence in the organization's ability to consistently provide conforming products and services. That is the very definition of effectiveness, ability to achieve planned results. And a similar approach obviously for environmental management systems, information security, energy management, and so on. So that mantra, output matters, we've tried to put that at the heart of everything that we do. It's not to say that all of these individual components are not important. Yes, they are. But it's the role of the auditor to ensure that they look at the way all of these things fit together and whether that system is actually effective in delivering on its promise. Now, of course, ISO 9001 has to be auditable. That was very, very important right from the start. It is a requirement standard. It's used for certification. And so, yes, it has to be auditable. And that was one of the design criteria that we came up with. But does auditable mean easy to audit? Absolutely not. The skills and abilities that we need as auditors today are much more challenging than they were in the past, because we are no longer able to say, please show me your procedure. Well, wait a minute, I don't have a procedure. I don't have a procedure because ISO 9001 doesn't require me to do that. We have a process that we are managing, for example, for purchasing, and a lot of it is in IT, a lot of it is computerized, and it's not a question of simply saying, show me the procedure, show me the records. And I think we can have a stark contrast, and we can see how things have evolved by making a comparison. If we look at, some of you may remember, 1987, clause 4.118, training. And this was typical of the kind of requirement that we had in those days. The supplier, what we today know as the organization, shall establish and maintain procedures to identify the training needs and provide for the training, and appropriate records of the training shall be maintained. So how do you ensure that people are aware of the quality policy, for example? Oh, well, we have a procedure here that says everybody should receive a 2-hour induction training within 2 weeks of their entering the company. And how do you demonstrate that's being done? Well, here are the records that so-and-so has signed, John Smith has signed the attendance sheet, and therefore everything's fine and dandy. Well, everything's not necessarily fine and dandy. You know, how do we know that John Smith actually paid attention during that training? How do we know that it didn't go in one ear and out of the other? May have signed the training records, may have been, well, in those days we didn't have smartphones, so, you know, wasn't texting and stuff, but wasn't paying attention to the training. And so the way all of this has evolved, and this is a real challenge not only for organizations, but also for certification bodies, for personnel certification bodies like Exemplar Global. And we start talking about competence, the ability to apply skills and knowledge in order to achieve the results needed. And so we say the organization shall determine the necessary competence for people who carry out activities relevant to the system and so on, and ensure that those persons are competent on the basis of appropriate education, training, or experience. That is a much more pragmatic approach, but it is also much more difficult to audit. It requires the auditor to understand what might be, or what are the skills and abilities needed and the knowledge needed for the different functions in order to be able to carry out their job in a good way. They may be regulatory requirements. They may be defined by qualification requirements by the customer. For example, you shall use non-destructive testing personnel who are qualified according to, you know, ASNT or whatever standard for ultrasonic inspectors. So that is one way of defining the competence, but in general, that will not be specified by regulatory bodies or by the customer, and it's down to the organization to decide what is the competence needed. What amount of training may I need to do in order to achieve that in order to achieve that objective, that people are competent. We may train and train and train and train, and there will always be that person who is not able to move with the times, who is not able to, for example, use remote auditing techniques, and I'll come back to that a little bit later on, or is not able to address some of the softer issues in auditing that we need to look at in order to be able to achieve our objectives. It may be that a person comes to our organization and they are already competent because they have undergone maybe a master's degree in environmental management or in quality management. They have a lot of experience in auditing or in carrying out their job, and they don't actually need any training. So what we have today, and when I was preparing for this seminar, I dug out some very old slides of mine that I was using back in the year 2000. Hard to realize that we're talking 17 years ago. And at that time, we were saying, what are the features of ISO 9001-2000? We were saying, well, there are more soft requirements that are harder to audit. Things like commitment. Top management shall demonstrate their commitment. Employee awareness. Work environment. Good communication. Customer perceptions. These are all things that it's very difficult to say to top management, show me the records that demonstrate that you are committed to the quality management system. It requires more person-to-person, face-to-face contact to tease out from the relevant people the information that will allow us as an auditor to make an objective judgment. Have we seen enough for us to have confidence that top management is committed to the quality management system, that employees are aware of their roles and responsibilities within the management system, and so on. And one of the features that we'll see a little bit later on is this very, very strong requirement in the 2015 versions of 9001 and 14001 for top management to demonstrate leadership. Again, we're not going to see that in necessarily a record or a procedure. We're going to see that by looking at the actions, by talking to top management, by a holistic approach during the entire audit to find out, is that leadership being demonstrated at all levels in the organization? So that was 17 years ago. Today, with the 2015 version, interestingly, the challenges remain very similar. ISO 9001-2015 has even less focus on documents, what we call now documented information, what we used to call documents and documented procedures and records. And we can still continue to call them documented procedures and records if we want to do that. There's no requirement for us to change our language. But much greater focus on achieving outcomes. Is that process, the way that the organization has defined that it is planning and managing the process, is that capable of consistently delivering the outcomes that we want from that process? As with the previous versions of ISO 9001, we actually carried out validation exercises during the draft international standard phase, where we put out the standard and asked people to look at it, to look at the implementation issues, to discuss what some of the difficulties might be. And these are just a couple of examples of the kind of responses we got, almost as if they were criticisms of the new standard. I take these as actually compliments, that auditing will now require auditors to understand the business. Shock, horror. Auditors in the past maybe could get away with the sort of bureaucratic approach, show me the procedures, show me the records, and not know very much about the business. Comments of the type, tick the box auditors will find this almost impossible to audit. Well, if there are still tick the box auditors around, I might respectfully suggest that it's about time they started thinking about, hanging up their boots and retiring, because tick box auditors don't have a place anymore in the modern management systems. So if we look then at the components of a typical management system, I would say, and this is my interpretation, this is not an ISO interpretation or an IAF interpretation. I see any management system as having what I call to be the administrative components. It's the definition of the policy, deployment of the objectives throughout the organization, some level of documentation depending on the context of the organization, internal audits, management review, control of non-conformities, and so on. I maintain that as a reasonably experienced auditor, I could audit just about any organization, irrespective of their sector or their, whether a product or service organization. I could implement a decent audit on those aspects. But where I will probably be very much lacking is if somebody asks me to audit an intensive care unit in a hospital or a semiconductor plant where I don't have experience, I will be struggling with the technical aspects. Same thing with environmental management system auditing. I need to understand and have the security of a sound technical basis where I can put things in their proper context. I can have an idea so that when I ask that person in the organization, do you have a documented procedure for this? And they maybe say, no, ISO 9001 doesn't require us to have a documented procedure. I need to be able to understand and say, yes, but what about the legislation, the European Union legislation XYZ, or what about the Food and Drug Agency legal requirements that say you must have a procedure for that? That comes with knowledge of the sector and knowledge of the business. And so that becomes more and more important, as does an understanding of the product specifications, the kind of ways in which people will specify the requirements for the product or service that's under consideration. So essentially that means that as an auditor, for me to ask the right questions and to ask the intelligent questions, I need to have at least a basic understanding of the cause and effect relationship for any process. I need to include a good old-fashioned dose of common sense, and I'll be talking a little bit more about common sense later on, to understand what are the factors that an organization should be controlling, should be managing in order to give it confidence in the ability of its processes to achieve their outcomes. What is the industry custom and practice? That doesn't necessarily mean that the industry custom and practice is always right, but we need to understand the language, we need to understand the jargon, and last item, this is a word that we'll hear time and time again, risk. Auditing, as we all know, is a sampling exercise. There are many ways we can carry out that sampling, but essentially a good auditor will do the sampling based on risk-based assessments. And that is one of the new principles introduced in ISO 19011 in the 2012 version, but also in the latest ISO IEC 17021 risk-based auditing. So that we will never have the luxury of having the time that we would ideally like to go into the depth that we would ideally like for all the processes of the organization. When there's too much to do and not enough time or other resources to do it, then as managers, if we are managing an audit, we have to prioritize. Looking back again at the 2000 version, some of the difficulties in auditing. Sound familiar? We said at that time, auditors need to understand the business of the organization. We talked about quality management, the softer issues of leadership, of involvement of people, all of those good things that are not black and white, and they never will be black and white. It's not yes, no, it's various shades of grey in between. We said that in very many cases, auditors might be timid in dealing with top management. I think many auditors, third-party auditors, still have difficulty in auditing top management. And I think internal auditors may have even more difficulty. If you are faced with auditing your boss's boss's boss, and of course there will be a certain degree of stress involved for you and for them. We said we need to focus more on results and less on documentation. Need to look outside the management rep's office, not just sit in the very conveniently in the nice air-conditioned or heated management rep's office and say, please bring me this, please bring me that, show me this record. We need to get out and look at what is actually happening on the shop floor, on the sales floor, in the actual service delivery environment. Well, of course, as we all know now, there may not even be a management representative, and so that requires us really to get out and look at the processes. Look at the processes and schedule the audit in such a way that we can get a good sampling of the processes. One example that I like to give is, for example, if we're auditing a hotel, it's no good in the audit plan for us to say, okay, we're going to audit the checkout process at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. 3 o'clock in the afternoon, hardly anybody is going to be checking out unless they've organized a late checkout. We should be looking at the checkout process probably at 8:30 in the morning on a Friday morning when there's a line to check out. And we can observe and we can see the way in which the process is being managed. We can look at the resources. We can look at the way in which the customers are being dealt with by the front office staff. And finally, we need to use common sense in auditing subjective requirements. So that was then. This is now. 2015 version, again with the validation exercise on DIS 9001. People were saying, we have difficulties understanding. What do you mean by the context of an organization? How are we going to audit that? And I'll come back to that in a minute. What about the relevant interested parties? How should we know who the relevant interested parties are? Do we require the organization to keep records of that or not? What about the actions to address risks and opportunities? What about organizational knowledge? And that is a new requirement of ISO 9001 that is really a little bit abstract. And I think many of us are still getting our heads around how that might be audited in a coherent and proactive way. And the type and extent of control of external provision. Now, when we looked at those within my technical subcommittee, obviously they raised a certain amount of concern for us. But when we looked at them, in essence, most of those have one thing in common. They are all new requirements. They're all new concepts. And so, of course, there will be a learning curve. And of course, we have to think about how we can deal with those. But in my view, this further emphasizes the need to move away from clause-by-clause auditing. I hope that very few of you who are listening to this webinar are still auditing clause-by-clause. So you don't audit clause 4.1 in isolation and say, now we're going to audit the context of the organization. And in isolation, we're now going to audit with the relevant interested parties. It becomes a holistic exercise where, of course, at some stage you have to relate things back to that particular clause, that particular requirement of the standard. But in order to conduct a realistic and effective audit, the information gathering stage will be throughout the whole of the audit, where you are putting things into their proper context. And before you finalize the audit, you have to ask yourself the question, have I seen enough for me to be able to say, yes, the quality management system of this organization is appropriate for its context. In other words, we don't have a sort of imported quality management system set of documentation that was developed by somebody in the nuclear power industry applied to a small office supply shop on the corner. Totally out of context, totally overkill, and they're the kind of things that will get ISO 9001 a bad name for being bureaucratic, and us as auditors for being, nitpickers and going over the top. So it becomes that holistic information gathering activity. Now, there's a sneaky word in ISO 9001:2015, and that word is to determine. And I'm sure those of you who have had experience in auditing to the new version of the standard, you'll have come across that many, many times. The organization shall determine the context in which it operates, shall determine the relevant interested parties, and so on. So when we look at the definition of what do we mean, what does it mean to determine something? It means establishing or finding out by research, examination, or calculation, based on what is to be determined and the complexity, criticality, or the inherent risks, the results may need to be documented. So if we are making critical components in an aerospace organization, if we are going to determine the customer requirements, that needs to be absolutely, I would say, documented within the regulatory context in which that organization is operating. If we're running a small shop selling office supplies, determining customer requirements, we're very often face to face with the customer and we can ask them. No need necessarily to have that documented on a case-by-case basis. So essentially, it's up to the organization to determine when documentation is needed, unless there is a specific requirement identified in ISO 9001, for example, the quality objectives, for example, the quality policy, or indeed in some other relevant standard to which the organization subscribes. But we as auditors, we need to take care not to oblige the organizations to keep records. Otherwise, we'll be going back in time. What we're wanting to do is focus on the output, focus on the way the organization is managing its processes, and de-bureaucratize the management system where it can be debureaucratized. I don't even know if that word exists, but I think you all know what I mean. But we do need to have objective evidence of conformity. That doesn't mean that the top bit there doesn't mean that organizations can say, oh, we don't need to keep any records anymore. We don't need any work instructions. As auditors, what is our role? Our role is to seek out objective evidence that the organization is doing things the way they should do them, the way they've defined that they do them, and taking into consideration the requirements of the relevant sector in which they work, whether they're customer requirements, statutory, regulatory requirements, and so on. And this is where it gets a little bit complicated, because objective evidence is defined in ISO 9000, data supporting the existence or verity of something. Note, objective evidence can be obtained by observation, measurement, test, or by other means. Great. Note 2, objective evidence for the purpose of audit generally consists of records, statements of fact, or other information which are relevant to the audit criteria and are verifiable. So that kind of induces us to look for records. But a good auditor should not become fixated on the need for records unless it's explicitly required by ISO 9001, by customer requirements, by regulatory requirements, and so on. We need to keep our minds open, particularly when we're auditing micro, small, and medium enterprises. We need to be objective, and we need to say, have they demonstrated that they are managing their processes in such a way to ensure consistent results. And there's a common link. The common link to all of this, the word risk. Risk, the definition I will use for this purpose of this presentation, the effect of uncertainty. The effect of uncertainty on the objectives or on the expected results. So ISO 9001:2015 recognizes that not all processes have the same impact on the organization's objectives on its ability to consistently provide conforming products. So some processes may need more documented procedures. They may need detailed work instructions. They may need qualification of the people who are operating those processes, and they may need very, very tight controls. There may be other processes where if something goes wrong with that process, it can be identified, it can be recovered, and from the economic perspective, it doesn't make sense necessarily to aim for zero defects in that process, because any problems in that process can very easily be detected and corrected and addressed early on during the manufacturing or the service delivery phase. So that risk-based thinking, I think my objective in this seminar is not to talk detail by detail about ISO 9001, but we're talking about auditing. 19011, the guidance standard for auditing management system standards, recognizes that auditors can focus their attention on matters of specific significance to the management system. To some extent, ISO 9001 has always addressed that, right back to the 1987 version, where it says audits shall be planned based on the status and the importance of the areas that are being audited. So it's quite feasible to have some areas of the organization, some processes being audited with a greater frequency and others being audited with a lesser frequency. Again, personal preference. I hate internal audits where there is a sort of intense effort, a quick round of internal audits done 1 month before the external audit, with the view of looking to see if there's any problems that the external auditor might find. I think it's much healthier to have an internal audit program that is scheduled during the course of the year. It's less intense for the internal audit team, and it allows that differentiation between the different processes in terms of the frequency of the audit and the amount of intensity of the audit. That's just a personal preference. And then IEC 17021 2015 version introduces that out of the auditing principles, it now introduces the principle of risk-based auditing. Excuse me 1 second, just while I get a drink of water, just to keep my voice from going too deep. Risk-based thinking. A quick drink of water, put the cap on, put it a long way away from the laptop computer that I'm using, which is actually not mine, so I absolutely don't want to spill water over the laptop computer. That's risk-based thinking. Okay, so 19011, sorry, I did say 2012 version, I think it's 2011 version is the actual version. Priority should be given to allocating resources to audit those matters of significance within the management system. If we are auditing an integrated management system, we may be auditing different components depending on the criticality of that component to the particular process or the particular area that we are looking at. For example, there may be some processes that can have a very, very profound impact on product quality, but don't have any impact or negligible impact on health and safety, and don't have any significant environmental aspects associated with them. But equally, there may be some characteristics, some processes where they affect product quality very little, but they can have very, very significant environmental associated with them and very, very significant health and safety hazards. So that is what we mean by risk-based auditing. When we are going to be auditing that particular process or that particular part of the organization, what is important, what isn't important? Now, in a third-party audit situation, essentially the auditor has to take a representative sample, all products, all processes, all customers, and take a sample of all of those things to provide a certain amount of confidence in the system. That's where the second party auditor is actually at an advantage. And we hear very often second-party auditors doing supplier audits, and they say, oh, we went in and we found things that the third-party auditor didn't find and should have found. Well, I think I have some sympathy with that, but equally, let's remember the difference is that for a second-party audit, the sampling can be much, much more targeted and much, much more focused. So I'm not looking at any contract review process for any customer for any product and taking a random sample. I want to see how the contract review process worked for my order number XYZ placed on such and such a day, because I know that there were production problems. I know there were all kinds of non-conformities during production, and I want to see how the system worked for that particular element of the quality management system. So much, much more targeted in second-party auditing. And I would say in a good internal audit should be even more targeted. If we can bring the auditee on board psychologically with the audit process, get the internal auditor not to be seen as the policeman who's looking for evidence of nonconformity, but as a friend who can, together with the management of the process or the area under that's being audited, look together and identify not only the weaknesses, but work in a proactive way to identify the weaknesses so that the organization, that part of the management, can actually look at how to set about eliminating those weaknesses. And yes, sharing best practices. Totally acceptable within an internal audit for the auditor to say, oh, I saw your colleague over there doing it this way. You might want to look at doing it like that and copying what they did. That's in the internal audit context. In an external audit, and particularly in a third-party audit context, that would be totally unacceptable. Oh, I just audited your competitor 2 weeks ago, and they're doing it like this, this, and this, and therefore you should be doing the same. Of course, I hope nobody's doing that, because that would be an extreme case of conflict of interest. So that concept known as risk-based auditing, and in 19011, in terms of auditor competence, standard says auditors should understand the types of risks associated with auditing, the risk management principles, methods and techniques relevant to the discipline and sector, such that the auditor can evaluate and control the risks associated with the audit program. 17021, new principle, risk-based approach. Not going to go through all of these, but certification bodies and their auditors need to take into account the risks associated with providing competent, consistent, and impartial certification. Not only from the point of view of managing real perceived impartiality, but looking at how the audit interacts with the audit client, what are the perceptions of the interested parties, any misleading statements by the certified client. You know, I may ask the certified organization, oh, could I see your customer complaints, please? Oh, we don't have any. Well, there are techniques that we can use to dig a little bit deeper, and maybe we go into the warehouse, and if it's a manufacturing organization, maybe we go into and we look for any returned goods, and that might tell us that there are in fact complaints from the customers. Or we may ask to look at the accounting department. Are there any credit notes issued? Well, that also may be an indication that the customer was less than satisfied with the service that was provided, and therefore resulted in some sort of a credit note. We also have the new ISO 17021 Part 3, 2017 version that was just published a couple of months ago, March 2017, now addresses competence topics for auditors, such as understanding the role of leadership and its impact on the quality management system, the application of risk-based thinking, determination of risks and opportunities. What is the knowledge that's needed in order to determine whether the organization has appropriately determined external and internal issues? In other words, the context, the needs and expectations of interested parties, including requirements for the products and services. Now, this is a question that I think we all need to ask. What are we looking for when we are making a conformity assessment? In the old days, we talked about adequacy audits or desktop audits or documentation audits. In other words, evidence that the way the organization is planning things actually meets the requirements of customers and other relevant interested parties, the relevant standards, including ISO 9001 or the sector standard, and applicable legislation. And then the second part is verifying the effective implementation of the system. We're looking for evidence that things are being done the way that they were planned, and that is resulting in the expected outcomes from that process and from the system. Now, adequacy is something that requires a much deeper technical understanding. If I'm doing an audit and somebody tells me, Nigel, you need to look for this and this and this, and these are the factors that are important for this process, and these are the kind of parameters that that process should be having control, I can go and I can do that. And that's the actual conformity assessment part of things. But for me to know what I should be looking for is very, very critical. And unless I have some understanding of that sector, I'm not going to be able to do that in an effective way. So the recent trend is for international standards to be less prescriptive, more performance focused. So auditors need to understand cause and effect. What controls are likely to be required? What documentation is needed? What level of competence? And so on. Which brings us to the so-called soft and subjective requirements. Example might be 9001/2015, clause 7.3, awareness. The organization shall ensure that relevant persons doing work under the organization's control shall be aware of, etc., etc., including their contribution to the effectiveness of the quality management system, benefits of improved performance, the implications of not conforming with the quality management system requirements. Well, how do we do that? Do we say you shall have a documented procedure? Well, the standard doesn't require it. Should we be looking at records? No, we should be talking to people. We should be observing, looking at, understanding the process and the relevance of the work that's being performed. I think most of you, I hope, are accustomed to the so-called who, what, when, where, why, and how, and then the show me as an auditing technique. But I think they should now be joined with a couple of other questions. One is, what if? What if this happens? What if that happens? What if this person who is knowledgeable in the process, and you're telling me you don't need a documented procedure because, you know, Mr. Fred Bloggs has been working on this for 30 years and he knows it inside out. What if Fred Bloggs gets sick? You know, or what if he decides to change job? That what if, risk-based thinking. Equally, those of you who've had kids who've passed through their teenage years, there's a very important other question, which is, so what? Show me your documented procedure for purchasing. I don't have one. So what? That so what keeps our feet on the ground. It means we are asking ourselves, is this really relevant? The organization shall ensure that relevant persons doing work under the organization's control are aware of, etc., etc., etc. Well, does that mean that the cleaner who is washing the office floor after work needs to be aware of the contribution to the effectiveness of the quality management system of their organization as a whole? Probably not. Does that affect the quality of the product that manufacturing organization is provided? Almost certainly not. Therefore, I am not going to worry too much about interviewing those cleaners. But if I'm auditing the cleaning company in the context of they are an outsourced service provider to the manufacturing company, then they are relevant to the work that's being done under that outsourced cleaning company's control. They are relevant to the quality management system of the cleaning company. And of course, I would expect them to be at least aware, not to the same level of sophistication as somebody in a electronics company, but I would expect them to at least to be aware and to be able to answer intelligently about what they're doing, why they're doing it, and what the implications are. So a typical subjective requirement, again, clause 7.5.1. The organization's quality management system shall include documented information determined by the organization as being necessary for the effectiveness of the quality management system. What's necessary documentation? Again, focus on results. What are the important factors to ensure that the planned results are being achieved? What's the level of competence, of education, of the workforce? It may be that we have, it's a multinational organization, it may be that in some parts of the organization, in some geographical areas, there is a need for more documentation because the educational level, the literacy level is different from the people who are carrying out the organization, maybe in the United States or in Europe. So what are the important factors to ensure that the planned results are achieved? Some documentation may need to be translated into local languages. It's no good just having a procedure that it meets all the requirements of the standard, but nobody can read it. Are there any customer regulatory requirements, and so on? So typically, these are the kind of questions we should be asking when we are auditing subjective requirements. So some considerations. We need to ask ourselves when we're auditing, does this add value to the overall confidence that the process or the organization is able to achieve its intended outcomes? How does it relate to the risk that the organization might not be meeting customer and applicable legal requirements? Remember that this may be more than one specific set of customer requirements. An organization may have many different product lines or service lines, and it can include the needs and expectations of end users and consumers throughout the supply chain. And I think one area that we are becoming increasingly aware of is things like the social aspects, supply chain, third, fourth tier, that may not be directly affecting the product quality with a small q. But if, for example, your major customers and consumers find out that somewhere down in the back of your supply chain you are using child labor, or you're running roughshod over the environmental protection of that particular country, you will find that you have problems. And so this is something that is becoming increasingly important and is increasing the perception of quality with a small q, as Dr. Duran used to call it, to quality with a big Q, which is much more all-embracing. We need to have experience on technical considerations. This is taken from the ISO IAF Auditing Practices Group guidance. And if you're not familiar with that, I really do strongly urge you to Google it, Google the ISO 9001 Auditing Practice Group, and there is a lot of useful, simply written, short papers, hints and tips on how to audit various components of a management system. If requirements are not considered to be appropriate, it's up to the auditee to provide objective evidence to show that the system is effective. So if the auditee comes along and says, well, no, I don't have a documented procedure for this, or I don't see the need to have traceability back to the original raw material manufacturer, then the auditee needs to demonstrate, I don't need it because of this and that. And it's up to the auditor again to ask the probing questions in the depth that is appropriate to the risk that that process or that supplier poses to the actual integrity of the management system. So some key lessons. When we're dealing with subjective requirements, we should always be checking, is the process effective? Is the way in which the organization has defined that it will conduct that process, is it actually providing satisfactory results? That doesn't mean that the organization can pull the wool over our eyes and yes, everything's fine, therefore please, don't bother looking at this anymore. We have to ask the what if kind of questions. It may be that satisfactory results are being achieved by good luck rather than by good management. We need to ask, are the customer statutory requirements being met? Is there any evidence of problems, such as non-conformities, customer dissatisfaction, associated with the way that those things have been defined, the way in which the processes are being managed? In other words, use the Plan, Do, Check, Act cycle. So in this final part of the presentation, I think we need to try to bring all of this together. This is my understanding of the three core concepts of ISO 9001:2015, of ISO 14001:2015, any management system standard, essentially. First of all, the organization needs to identify what are the processes needed to achieve the planned results. We've talked about that already. The processes that need to be managed to achieve the appropriate environmental performance, that may include, for example, processes to manage the wastewater treatment plant, which don't have any influence on the product quality of the organization's tangible products, but it has a big influence on the environmental management system. And so therefore, if we are looking at the holistic approach, we want to be an environmentally responsible company, then the water treatment plant would be a process that needs to be managed, even though it probably doesn't affect product quality from the traditional quality management perspective. Second, continually monitor the risks, what we know as risk-based thinking, understanding that cause and effect relationship, and finally manage the processes and the system as a whole using Plan, Do, Check, Act. So if we put all of that together, what is a process? And I hope everybody understands that very well. A process is a set of interrelated activities for transforming inputs into desired outputs. Those desired outputs are the product or the service, and they are delivered to the customer. That customer may be an internal customer, it may be an external customer. So if we think about it, internal audit is a process. Internal audit has its inputs. What's the status and importance of the activities that are to be audited? What are the results of the previous audits? What do we have in terms of our audit team? And that inputs into a set of interrelated activities, planning of the audit, scheduling, audit team selection, actual conducting of the audit, consolidation of audit findings, preparation of a report, which eventually will be the outcome, which is the audit report, which will go to the customer, maybe the audit coordinator or top management of the organization. So we're not just talking about manufacturing processes here or actual service delivery processes. We have to recognize that there are other interested parties. And this is another feature of ISO 9001:2015. It's not just the customer, maybe the consumer, maybe a regulatory body, maybe a franchisor. So if, for example, I'm a McDonald's franchise and I start deviating too much from the McDonald's way of doing things, then the franchisor may not be very happy with me. If I start introducing variations that the customers might be happy with, but they deviate from the franchisor's overall quality philosophy. We have undesired outputs, waste, pollution. So when we're looking at a process-based quality management system, ISO 9001 is totally compatible with things like lean initiatives. What is lean? If not driving out any activity or process that doesn't add value. If we think about this process approach, this helps us, and this is where internal audits particularly can have a very, very important role to play in identifying activities that do not add value. So how is that process carried out? It may or may not be documented, and I contend that the extent of the planning will depend on the risk that that process poses to what we want to achieve, whether it's a highly hazardous process that may have an impact on health and safety, or whether it's something that involves toxic chemicals that we need to manage in order to avoid environmental concerns, or maybe energy usage, or in the ISO 9001 context, potential to deliver non-conforming products. So we have all of these different interactions that the process might have: product conformity, environmental, social, energy usage, and so on, as I just mentioned. And we can monitor and measure those activities before, in terms of inputs, during, and after the process is carried out. And the amount of monitoring and measuring that we do will also depend on the risk, ranging from 100% inspection at all stages in the process to very, very low sampling, or in some cases just relying on process capability statistics to say we don't need to sample because we have the data to know that that process has a very high CPK value and has very, very high process capability. So there we have the concept of the process approach, understanding the process, risk-based thinking, and then we add on top of that planning the process, carrying out the process, verifying the process, and then acting to feed back into the planning process with that focus on continual improvement. That is what we as auditors should be looking for when we are auditing a quality management system or an environmental management system. We can't impose that on the organization, but we need to be saying to ourselves, is the organization doing this? And not only at the level of individual processes, but do all those processes fit together in order to deliver on the overall promise of the system? Managing each individual process, and I use the term synonymously. For me, managing anything means using Plan, Do, Check, Act. We may have somebody over here, process owner, managing process E very nicely, but there is a mismatch here between process C, which is providing inputs, and process E, which may lead to non-conforming products, or at the very least to some kind of inefficiencies in the system. So we need to take a step back and we need to look at the Plan, Do, Check, Act of the system as a whole, and that's where things like internal audits start to come in. In terms of audit technique, to summarize, for the modern auditor of modern management systems, we need to focus much, much more on the process. We need to observe and less on documentation, documented procedures. Recognizing that some documented procedures, work instructions, checklists, and so on, may be necessary in order for the organization to plan and control its processes, but the driving force should be process performance. Focus more on results and less on records. Yes, of course, some records may be necessary depending on the particular business context to show that the processes are effective. But a value-added auditor should be aware of and give credit for other forms of evidence. We need to use Plan, Do, Check, Act to evaluate the organization's process effectiveness. Has the process been planned? How has it been planned? Is it being carried out according to the plan? Talk to people, understand their level of understanding of the process. Are the planned results being achieved? Are there any opportunities for improvement that are being identified and implemented, either by correcting non-conformities, identifying root causes and implementing corrective action, identifying trends, or by innovation? So all of that requires us to use that holistic approach to evidence gathering throughout the organization instead of focusing on individual clauses of ISO 9001:2015. If it's done properly, in my experience, a third-party audit of a new client is an extremely tiring activity for an auditor. I come away occasionally from third-party audits exhausted because you're looking at the interactions. You're not looking at isolated clauses. You're looking at the way the whole organization works together. You're looking at relationships. You're looking at the body language. You're looking at the way that organizations interact and the different organizational elements interact, rather than clause by clause audit. So eventually, we have to put these findings into perspective. Risk assessment, common sense. You know, I remember the words of my dear departed grandfather. He said, one of the problems with common sense, Nigel, is that it's not so common. That so what question that our teenage kids very often ask us. So what if they don't have a documented procedure? ISO 9001 doesn't require it. They're not operating in a regulatory environment. There's no customer requirements. Everybody knows their role. They've received verbal communication. They are competent to do the activity. So what? The activity is, or that process is achieving its intended outcomes, and therefore it's effective. So to summarize, I hope I've encouraged you in this webinar to think process. Think process, and if we use the example of purchasing, in the old days, don't think of purchasing as clause as it was 7.4, or now control of externally provided products clause 8.4 of the new standard. Don't think of it as a clause. Don't think of it, oh, I'm now going to audit the purchasing department. Many of the relevant activities will probably be carried out in a, inverted commas, purchasing department. But think of it as a process that begins with somebody saying, we need to purchase XYZ components or such and such a training course. That person is probably not going to be in the purchasing department, but they are the initiators of the process, and we need to follow the audit trail in order to be able to check if that process as a whole is actually effective. So I hope that's been useful for you. It's been a pleasure to interact. I'd like to thank Exemplar Global for giving us this opportunity, and wish you every success with the rest of the symposium. So thank you very much.
This ends today's presentation. Thanks for attending.
That was excellent. You're a pro.